Welcome to this lecture in my series, The History of New Orleans. I'm Bruce Baker, and this lecture is The Purpose and Early History of New Orleans. It's going to cover the period in the city from the founding in 1718 up through most of the French colonial period. To some extent, if you've seen the other videos in this series that are within this first week of the 9-week series, you'll see that there's a certain amount of overlap, and I'm sort of coming at some of the same things from slightly different angles, but hopefully it all sort of ties together. So if we start with the main idea of this lecture is that New Orleans was established in order to be an administrative and commercial center for a French settlement that would challenge Britain and Spain for hegemony in North America, and that would link up France's Caribbean sugar colonies and link it up with their existing colony in Canada and create, essentially, if you think about it, a sort of arc going from the St. Lawrence River sort of down to the Great Lakes, down through the Mississippi River, out to the Gulf of Mexico, and across to the sort of crown jewel in the French Empire in the Caribbean of Saint-Domingue, which is producing the majority of the world's sugar at this time. So, why was Louisiana established, aside from that sort of geographical imperative? Well, to understand this, we start with the death of King Louis XIV in 1715. And when Louis XIV died, France had a lot of debt because they had been fighting a lot of wars. And actually servicing that debt was consuming almost all of the annual revenue. So they're so far in debt, we think a lot nowadays about national debt and GDP and so forth. And essentially, most of the revenue that was coming into the French government was spent not on things that you might spend it on, but simply on servicing this existing debt. So there was great concern to fix these economic problems in order to create greater political stability. So that's quite an imperative for France at this time. The other thing is that, and it's not helping their economic situation, is that France has become increasingly dependent on tobacco coming from the Chesapeake since the 1690s. So, at this point, we introduced a guy named John Law. He was a really smart guy from Scotland. We can sort of think of him in the context of the thinkers who were coming out of Scotland in the 18th century, mostly a little bit later in the 18th century, but he's sort of in that category. And he establishes what's called the system in France. He goes to work for the French crown, and he thinks, what should we do about this debt problem? And he comes up with something that nowadays we would think of as sort of a debt for equity swap. So he creates a trading company called the Company of the West, and buys shares in that trading company with government bonds. So the bonds are being spent at face value. It's a good deal for the bondholders. They're not being told, well, we're not going to pay all of what we thought we were going to pay, so they're not getting any kind of a haircut there, and it's a good deal for everybody. What that means then is that the Company of the West holds these government bonds. And of course, bonds, if we think about it, how they work, is you invest money, you will get that principal back at the end of a certain number of years, but in the meantime, you get interest payments. And what's happening now is that the Company of the West is holding those government bonds, and the French government is now paying the Company of the West the interest payments. So the money that it had been spending to service the debt, which had been going to private bondholders, private investors, and they were doing whatever they were doing with it, building chateaus and buying expensive wine and fancy luxury goods and whatever. So that money that was servicing the debt is now going into the Company of the West. And the Company of the West is using that money for ventures, for investments and so forth, to boost the economy and sort of hopefully drag France out of this economic problem that it's in. This sort of starts out well, and in 1717 to 1720, John Law starts buying up several other French trading companies. So the Company of the West becomes a very big high stakes sort of thing. Sounds like quite a good idea. Now we get to the question of the role that Louisiana plays in the system. So in 1718, as part of John Law's system and what he's going to do with the Company of the West and so forth, the government gives Law the right to control the tobacco trade. And Law rather boldly promises that Louisiana will supply all the tobacco that France needs by 1721. So in 3 years, they're going to be completely not dependent on tobacco from the British colonies in the Chesapeake, and they're going to have their own supply from Louisiana and so forth. To do this in 3 years, it's imperative that he creates a workforce in the lower Mississippi Valley. So the Company of the West, agrees to send 6,000 French settlers and 3,000 African slaves there within 10 years. There's one of the other lectures I mentioned the sort of very sudden surge of enslaved African labor there, and this is sort of why. It's because Law has made a ridiculous promise that he's going to accomplish something in 3 years, and so he's not going to be able to do that unless he has a labor force, and that's the motivation for this very rapid import of African slaves. So the settlement of Louisiana is going to need a main town for a settlement. That's a fairly common pattern amongst French colonies. They tend to be built around a central urban settlement. And the person put in charge of this project is Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne, Sieur de Bienville. And he is a really interesting guy. And here's an image of him. It's obviously not a contemporary picture, but it's I have the image credit at the end of this, and it's an illustration. So Bienville was interesting in a lot of ways. As I discussed in another one of these lectures, the French had a different way of interacting with Native Americans than the English colonial powers did. And it was based on a much more closer connection, a much more sort of sympathetic understanding or detailed understanding of the culture, and a little bit more equal sort of relations. So we certainly can say that Bienville really understood the Indian way of doing things. And we can sort of see that on his body. As you can see, this isn't a painting of him or a photograph from the time, but it's an illustration that is based on contemporary descriptions. And here's how one of his contemporaries described him. Quote, "An officer, a man of breeding whose name you would recognize, who as well as an image of the Virgin and the baby Jesus, a large cross on his stomach with the miraculous words which appeared to Constantine, and an endless number of marks in the savage style, had a snake which passed around his body and whose tongue pointed toward an extremity which I will leave you to guess." End quote. So he does this because Native Americans in the South often had their skin covered, as another description says, quote, "covered with figures of snakes which they make with the point of a needle. Mr. de Bienville, who is the general of the country, has all of his body covered in this way, and when he is obliged to march to war with them, he makes himself nude like them. They like him very much, but they also fear him." End quote. So Bienville is just an interesting guy, and I think that the tattoos are dramatic, but they reinforce to us that part of why he was as successful as he was that he understood and sort of entered into the local cultural way of doing things in a way that we really don't associate with English colonists. I'm not really aware of any English colonial governors who had their bodies covered with tattoos and that sort of thing. So it's a novelty in a way, but it makes a serious point as well. The other thing that we have to remember about Bienville is, as I was discussing in the other lecture, he really gets the idea of gift exchanges, and he understands how diplomacy works. So in a way, we can sort of think of the French as not really sort of dominating militarily as much as sort of operating alongside Native Americans, which does not say that there's obviously not military interaction and exploitation and so forth, but partly because they're not militarily powerful enough to overwhelm Native Americans. And remember that in the lower Mississippi Valley, there are more Native Americans than non-Native Americans until the end of the 18th century. So the numbers are against the French. You know, they couldn't really dominate the situation that way if they wanted to. But Bienville really understands how they handle diplomacy. He's not in a rush, as Lawrence Powell in The Accidental City phrases it. I use his quotations a lot. It's a great book. You should definitely read it. It says that Bienville understood that, quote, above all else, diplomacy could not be rushed, nor wrongs go unavenged, end quote. So Bienville becomes the figure who founds New Orleans and does so in a way that establishes a balance, anyway, with local Native American groups. So, in March of 1718, Bienville took the first men, the first French, to the site that becomes New Orleans. He sort of bent the rules in order to choose this spot. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes decisions being made on the Gulf Coast and in Paris about where the headquarters of Louisiana should be. Bienville liked the site of New Orleans for reasons that you can get into, and he basically took the initiative, sort of bent the rules in order to choose this spot. Just as the city is getting started, though, the system that John Law established sort of collapses. So if we think this is the time period of the South Sea bubble, and this is the Mississippi bubble, and it collapses, and it's part of one of the really first big international financial crises that happens. And in a way, this is sort of good for New Orleans because it means that the French central authorities are not keeping quite such a close eye on what Bienville is doing. And he's able to really sort of, he's already sort of gotten a few people there, and he's able to bring in more settlers and bring in enslaved laborers in this period. Sort of in this period of sort of confusion and lack of central direction, he's just sort of getting on with things locally. Eventually, headquarters decides they do need to sort of figure out what's going on, and they send Adrien de Pouget, a royal engineer, to Louisiana in 1721, and his job is to, as an engineer, to look at the site of New Orleans and decide whether it's a suitable site and maybe it needs to be moved somewhere else. But once he gets there, Bienville convinces Pouget that it is a good site, and Pouget reports back, yes, this is fine, and he begins to actually lay out and design and clear the area that becomes the French quarter. So when we think, however, things don't really go quite as planned, or they go okay for a while, but the 1729 Natchez uprising, the Natchez are a Native American tribe in the area, that becomes a significant turning point in the very early history of New Orleans. So Bienville had established a garrison at this point as early as 1716, and the Natchez were suffering from disease, they were having problems with bad trade deals, ever since they had sort of started engaging with the French, but relations had been okay. If we remember what I said about Bienville sort of bending the rules, and in the other lecture about the question of sort of political factions forming for him and against him and so forth, well, he eventually sort of runs foul of this and is fired and is replaced by a guy named Shapur. And Shapur decides that there's a Natchez village that he wants to clear out of the way in order to establish a tobacco plantation and give the plantation to a friend of his. So he clears this village out of the way, and this is sort of the final straw. And on the 28th of November, 1729, around 700 Natchez warriors converge and massacre 145 men, 90 women and children, and about 300 African slaves. This, naturally, freaks the French out. They're very worried about a potential alliance between Native Americans and enslaved African laborers. This is a not uncommon sort of fear. At this time, we see similar kinds of things if we think about the Carolina colony, roughly the same time, with things like the Yamasee War and the Tuscarora War. So there are always these concerns in southern colonies that these two groups, who are both suffering from the policies and practices of colonial powers, might team up together. Because of this concern, this sort of sense of instability, the company, John Law's company, Company of the West, realizes that Louisiana really is more trouble than it's worth. They have not been able to accomplish what he had intended them to accomplish in terms of providing tobacco and so forth, and they give the colony back to the Crown in 1731. The Crown, looking at what Bienville's replacement had done, gets rid of him, brings Bienville back, and reinstates him as governor in 1733, but times have changed, and Bienville is not quite as successful as he had been before. In 1739, he leads a fairly unsuccessful military expedition against hostile Indians, and this leads Paris to sort of realize that they weren't going to be able to control the North American frontier through military force. That simply, given the demographics, given the geography, how far away they were from other settlements in Canada and Saint Domingue and so forth, that it simply wasn't going to work in the same way that they thought it might. They're also sort of realizing that they're just not going to get rich on tobacco. The whole sort of purpose of the Louisiana colony to produce tobacco and sort of prop up the French economy and wean them off this dependence on Virginia tobacco is not going well. So that raises an interesting question, which is what's going to happen to New Orleans if it's not the sort of urban hub, the sort of trading center for a successful agricultural exporting colony? So it's very clear that Louisiana is not going to be the sort of agricultural success that Saint Domingue was. So there have been visions of Saint Domingue exporting tons of sugar, Louisiana exporting tons of tobacco, and everybody's getting rich in France. That's not happening. All these enslaved laborers that have been brought over are not very profitable, so they're actually given more freedom in order to raise their own food. So they're certainly not going to be wanting to spend money so that they can raise tobacco, because they're not really raising tobacco, it's not working. So enslaved laborers are sort of providing for themselves more. They have, therefore, a lot more mobility and independence than they might if the plantations had been thriving and they'd just been working dawn till dusk raising tobacco. There are more enslaved people that are earning money and sort of developing customary rights, ways of doing things, and their owners sort of have to allow that because they are very necessary to the functioning and survival of the colony. And they certainly, the colony as a whole isn't bringing in the profits on tobacco that had been expected. Before very long, you have a number of enslaved people who are sort of small-level merchants who are trading. You have a growing number who are skilled artisans. And in a way, it's really at this point, in the sort of middle of the 18th century, when Louisiana is a bit of a basket case as far as the original economic purpose, and you have this large proportion of enslaved laborers who, in a way, don't have, it's not that they don't have anything to do, but they're certainly not fulfilling the economic function that the imperial government sort of envisioned for them. And with this greater flexibility and greater self-reliance and different kinds of interactions, that we can sort of see the beginning of a Creole culture, sort of hybridizing of elements from a number of different cultures. So we don't have a strong distinction between the colonial settlers from France and the enslaved laborers from Africa, or African origin, as much as we might in a plantation economy that was thriving, that was really sort of well integrated into the imperial system and really operating at peak efficiency. So in a way, we can sort of see the beginnings of what we think of as New Orleans sort of Creole hybridized culture in this moment. So this leaves us again with this question of sort of what's going to happen economically to the city of New Orleans. There aren't any really good exports. Tobacco, lumber, indigo, none of those are really working. And because they don't really have anything significant to export, traders will not come all the way to New Orleans. Instead, they come from France to Saint-Domingue and trade there. New Orleans becomes a bit of an outpost. They have to deal through middlemen. This adds on to the costs and everything. And again, since mercantilism isn't working, the colony can't supply the raw materials, the metropolitan center can't supply finished goods. What takes its place is considerable amounts of smuggling. And as we see this new society developing, as we see enslaved people with greater freedom and greater mobility and so on, one of the reactions to that, as we get towards the middle of the 18th century, kind of just before the 7 Years' War kicks off, we start seeing attempts by the colonial authorities to sort of tighten up on the slavery system. And so we get the beginnings of new laws trying to control how enslaved people move and interact and so forth. So we get laws in 1744 and again in 1751. And that brings us up to the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, and of course, as I went through in a different lecture, the end of French control of Louisiana, except for a brief bit with Napoleon, but that's for another lecture. Thanks.